I am the author of Wisconsin Cocktails, as well as 13 other books, including the unofficial all-day cookbook and Drink Like a Woman. And tonight we're going to be talking about the history of why we drink what we drink in Wisconsin. Now, the oft-told story goes that the reason we drink so much brandy in Wisconsin, and we drink more brandy here than anywhere else in the world, with the exception maybe being the Cognac region of France, and we drink it in a more unusual way than lots of other places. The oft-told story goes that there were these three Czech brothers who settled in California and had a winery, and they made brandy, and their names were Korbel. And they took their brandy to what was at the time the biggest event in the country, and that was the Columbian World Exposition in Chicago in 1893. And the story goes that the good folk of Wisconsin who went down to Chicago, because there were six major train lines that went from Wisconsin to the city of Chicago, and a vast majority of our population at the time likely went to the World's Fair if they could go there. And they discovered Korbel's wonderful grape elixir, and that's why we drink brandy. And when I started to work on my book, Wisconsin Cocktails, I set out to prove the Korbel theory true. But here's the thing, I couldn't find any evidence of it. The more I researched old newspapers, old restaurant and bar menus, and everything I could get my hands on, the more I realized I couldn't find anything like that. Moreover, I found a document published by the state of California about every single California vendor who was at the fair, and there were 25 other wineries that displayed brandy. And then I discovered a very curious article published in 1894 in the Milwaukee Journal. And the article talked about how the young German men of Milwaukee, for them, beer was not enough. They needed to pursue this mysterious elixir called the cocktail. And then the writer went on to detail the popular drinks in Milwaukee in 1894. And there was a drink that had brandy. It was called a morning bracer, but it's nothing like any cocktails we drink today. It had absinthe and soda water and other weird things. And we don't drink brandy like that. But you know what the most popular cocktail was called? It was called an old fashioned. And this was an old fashioned made with whiskey, sugar, and bitters. And that's the old fashioned that everybody else drinks, that Wisconsin doesn't drink right now, but everyone else in the world drinks. So I had to ask the question, what happened between 1894 when we drank our old fashioned strong with whiskey to now with brandy and muddled ingredients? So I continued to dig. And one thing I found was an article also published in the Milwaukee Journal, but this was in 1975. And in this article, they interviewed a man who was the Christian Brothers distributor of brandy for the state of Wisconsin, and he had been in the liquor distribution business since 1937. And what he said is, yeah, we always drank more brandy, but 2 times nothing is still nothing. He said what happened is in the 1940s, after the war, around 1945, he said 1946, but later I found an article in 1945. But basically what he said, at one time, our state had access to a whole lot of really good brandy. And what happened post-World War II, you have to understand the scenario, is there was a lot of bad booze going around. Distilleries in Kentucky and elsewhere shut down so grains could be shipped over to Europe. So there was a shortage of really good booze. And there also at the time, if you looked at any police blotters post-World War II in Wisconsin, you'd find bar owners who were cited or arrested for adulterating booze. Oftentimes they would take good booze or bad booze and put it into good bottles. There was also one incident, a whole bunch of bad Portuguese brandy that was confiscated and poured into Lake Michigan because it had sediment. So in any case, at that time, Wisconsin liquor distributors got a hold of a cache of aged brandy in barrels, 30,000 barrels worth, from Christian Brothers, and they bought the whole thing and shipped it to Wisconsin. So if you're going to have your old fashioned or Manhattan, were you going to have it made with rot gut whiskey or good brandy? Well, you're going to have it made with good brandy. And then you kept drinking it, good brandy. And then your kids started drinking good brandy. And then your grandkids started drinking good brandy. And suddenly everybody's drinking, but nobody knows why. Now, what I found interesting is, well, okay, why did this story about Korbel get told over and over and is still being told again in both national and local Wisconsin publications? Now, the reason for this is in about 2008, there was a writer who was wondering, why do we drink so much brandy? He was searching online, researching the Columbia Exposition, and he found an article published in an Illinois newspaper that detailed Korbel's history, how it was involved in so many presidential elections and inaugurations, and then how its brandy was at the World's Fair. And this writer said, aha, this is my eureka moment. This is why we drink brandy. Now, the other reason why the Korbel story fell apart is Korbel actually stopped making brandy during Prohibition and did not start until the 1960s. And we were already drinking a lot of brandy in the 50s. What happened, of course, is after the Christian Brother brandy was bought up, brandy makers started selling and marketing their brandy to Wisconsin because it's like, oh, they drink brandy. We don't have to explain anything. We just have to advertise to them. And in the 1960s, when Korbel started up again, they had a very popular marketing slogan that went something like, only a nickel more and worth it, which played on our thrifty sensibilities. So it's only a nickel more, but we get this much more quality, so we might as well drink Korbel. Now, the other thing is if you actually talk to people at Korbel, who are wonderful people, and I've talked to them for many stories, they will tell you that they can't confirm the story about Korbel and the Columbia Exposition, and that's why we drink brandy. And they can't confirm it, partly because they don't have records that go that far back, but the other reason is because it's not true. It's a story of marketing and opportunity. Now, that's why we add brandy to our old fashions. The other component, of course, of our old fashions is we don't just make them with spirits, bitter, and sugar. We actually muddle cherries and oranges, and then we top it with sweet, sour, or club soda. Now, that piece of the puzzle was more easy for me to discover. During Prohibition, of course, there was bad booze. And to cover up the taste of bad booze at speakeasies and saloons, bartenders would add fruits and fruit juices, and they kept adding it after Prohibition. I also found a story that was post-Prohibition when bars were legally reopening, but of course in Wisconsin, bars never closed. And the feds used to describe Wisconsin as the Wild West of the nation when it came to being liquor scofflaws. The other interesting thing is post-Prohibition, though, they were all on the up and up, and lots of tavern owners wanted to relearn how to make cocktails. So there was this guy who called himself Professor Smith, and he traveled to Milwaukee, and people from around the state went to his seminar. And he described as a properly made old-fashioned is just whiskey, bitters, and sugar. And he blamed it, of course, on women. Our sweet tooths are why people adulterate and change the old-fashioned. But he also said, you want to have women in your bars because if you bring the women in, then the men are going to follow. Now, I would say in Wisconsin, men and women drink old fashions with fruit and don't have a problem with it. So I'm not sure about his whole business of blaming the women. But I also found it interesting is post-Prohibition, there was a story about bartending slang in the Milwaukee Sentinel, and bartenders used to call the old-fashioned a fruit salad. So I thought that was kind of cute and funny. But let's get to making some of our cocktails. The first one I'm going to make, though, is the traditional old-fashioned, the way people make an old-fashioned, and what you're going to get if you go to New York or Chicago or just about anyone. But if you order brandy, usually they'll say, "You're from Wisconsin, aren't you?" And we're like, "Yeah," and we're proud of it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take some bourbon. It's usually bourbon or rye, and this is still an oak bourbon made here in Wisconsin at the Great Lakes Distillery, which is the oldest distillery in Wisconsin, the first distillery to open post-Prohibition. Now, what's interesting also, when I looked at the old Milwaukee city directories, they were the equivalent of a phone book, but they obviously didn't have phones back then. But if you look back in the early 1900s and late 1800s, there were 5 distilleries in Milwaukee alone. The year after Prohibition, none of them survived. So anyway, what you're going to do is you're going to take 2 ounces. And one thing I would recommend, the easiest way to make cocktails is to have jiggers that actually have markings. And I don't know if you can see here, but there are lines that indicate 1.5 ounces or 2 ounces. And in here, I have a quarter, a half, 3/4, and a whole ounce so that you can properly measure. Bartending is more akin to baking. You want to be more exact. I mean, if you don't care, then you can throw things in, but it may not taste exactly the same. But you take 2 ounces. And then you add either sugar, it used to be a sugar cube, or I would say about 1/4 to 1 ounce of simple syrup. And simple syrup is another one of those things. If you talk to bartenders, they'll talk about rosemary simple syrup or blackberry simple syrup or things that sound really complicated. But simple syrup is basically sugar and water. The basic recipe is equal parts sugar, equal parts water, hot enough to dissolve it. If your sink has hot water, you could just pour it straight from the tap, stir it, let it dissolve. That's your simple syrup. If you want to get fancier, things like rosemary, heat up water and sugar, bring it hot, throw in the herbs, let it steep for about 10 minutes to 30 minutes. When it smells like rosemary, take it out. There you go. You've got a rosemary simple syrup. So anyway, the other ingredient, of course, is bitters. And the classic bitters used in both a traditional old-fashioned and a Wisconsin old-fashioned is Angostura bitters. Now I'm going to take a moment to tell you a story about Angostura bitters because besides brandy, we drink more Angostura bitters than anywhere else in the country. And the reason for it is not just our old-fashions, but there's a bar on Washington Island called Nelson's. It stayed open during Prohibition, and the reason why it did is Bill Nelson, who owned it, he served shots of bitters. He said they were medicinal, so they stayed open. And you can go join the Bitters Club. You'll get a little card. I got one when I went there that will certify that you drank an entire shot of bitters. They go through cases. And the current owner, she says, bitters companies from all over keep trying to get her to buy other bitters. And she's like, nah, I'll stick with this stuff. You want to add about two shots or 2 dashes. And then with the traditional old-fashioned, what you do is you stir it. And to stir, you take a cocktail spoon and you just stir. And what you want to do is you want to stir it until there's some condensation on the shaker. And then you can either strain it or over the rocks or straight up. into a cocktail glass. And I'm using a wine glass because that's what they used to use, elegant wine glasses. And you just simply garnish it with a lemon. If you want to get fancy, you squeeze it a little bit or rub it around the edge to give the aroma. And it smells delicious and boozy, which it is. Now, what we're going to do next, of course, is the Wisconsin version. Now, a traditional Wisconsin old-fashioned is made, it starts with an orange, which you drop in the bottom of your shaker. And then you're going to add 1 or 2 cherries. Now, you can make your own, and we'll talk about making your own brandied cherries, which I think are the best, especially made with Door County cherries. But there is a company here in Wisconsin, Soul Boxer, which does bottled brandy old fashions and whiskey old fashions and brandy Manhattans and whiskey Manhattans. Soul Boxer, once a year during this time of year, will go up and get a whole bunch of Door County cherries, which is then jarred with a little bit of the Soul Boxer brandy old fashioned mix right in it. They're phenomenal. They're great. Sequist Orchards up in Door County also makes Door County cherries. They're not always available. There's also a good local cherry company in Michigan, Traverse City Whiskey Distillery, also bottles their Traverse City, Michigan cherries in whiskey. And those are also good. Luxardo cherries are good. You can always go with Manhattan cherry with maraschino. But if you don't, a brand that's kind of middle of the road but good is called Filthy Cherries. And I love the name, Filthy. So anyway, you add a cherry, you add an orange slice, you add a couple dashes of bitters, and then of course you add sugar or brandy. Sugar and then brandy. Now in Wisconsin, a traditional old-fashioned is made with sugar cubes. 1 to 3 sugar cubes in terms of the level of sweetness. Like the traditional old-fashioned, you're going to go with 2 ounces, but in this case, we're going to use brandy. I'm using Great Lakes Distillery Bright Woods Apple Brandy. And then what you're going to do is muddle. Now, when you're muddling fruit and sugar and bitters and alcohol, you do not have to worry how hard you press. You can get really messy and squishy. But if you're making a mojito or anything with herbs, you want to gently press it and not totally muddle it because the bitterness of the herbs will seep into your cocktail. Now, typically what you want to do with this is you want a nice slurry mess if you are using straight sugar. If not, you're going to use simple syrup. Of course, you add ice. And then there's 2 methods to finishing this. You can either shake it or you can roll it, which I think is a nicer way. And rolling it is just going back and forth till it's nice and mixed. Now, here's the other thing. Here in Wisconsin, usually they serve the whole mess in a glass filled with ice, and you don't even strain it. You just pour it right in. But then, of course, it's topped with soda. And that is a perfect Wisconsin old-fashioned. Now, one thing I didn't have time to get today, but I absolutely love for a perfectly, totally Wisconsin-made ingredients old-fashioned. If you like it sour, I recommend going and buying Top Note Tonics grapefruit soda. Top Note's mixers and tonics are made for cocktails, and their grapefruit soda added to an old-fashioned is absolutely sublime. And Top Note Tonic was created in Milwaukee by Mary Pelletieri, who used to work for Miller. And she eventually thought she'd open up a brewery, but making herbal beers, but she liked the herbal concoctions better. And she created a tonic company. And besides making a wide array of fantastic tonics, her grapefruit soda and her bitter lemon, they're just phenomenal by themselves. The grapefruit also makes an amazing Paloma. Now we're going to do a hybrid cocktail. And it's a modern cocktail. It's served at Great Lakes Distillery. And what I like about this cocktail is it's sort of a cross between a Wisconsin old-fashioned and a traditional old-fashioned. And it's a very, very boozy cocktail. And the way it's made is you start out with 2 ounces of their Still and Oak bourbon or rye, whichever you prefer. And then you add a full ounce of their Goodland orange liqueur. Now, what I like about Guy Rehorse, besides the fact that he's just a great guy, is he has a good sense of humor. And Goodland he took from the Wayne's World movie when one of the characters said, "Millie, okay, that's Algonquin for the good land." So he took that joke and turned it into a whole line of fruit liqueurs. Besides orange, he makes a phenomenal Door County cherry liqueur and a cranberry liqueur, as well as a coffee liqueur. And with this, you're going to add 1 full ounce of orange liqueur, 2 dashes of bitters. You're going to add ice, and just like the traditional old-fashioned, you're going to stir it. And you're going to stir it again. Basically, with stirring, what you want is you want it just cold enough. Again, you see condensation. That means it's cold enough. And that's the same thing shaking. If it starts to feel cold, then the ingredients inside your shaker are cold. And I'm going to serve this neat in a little mason jar. And again, serve it with a little bit of orange squeezed on top. And there you go. Now, an interesting variation of this, which makes it taste even more like a Wisconsin old-fashioned, is to add a 1/4 ounce of cherry liqueur. And then it looks even more like a cherry and orange old-fashioned, flavored old-fashioned. Now, one of the things that right now we're blessed with, of course, is the Door County cherry season. In Milwaukee, where I live, at my farmer's market at Lake Michigan, we've had for the last couple of weeks, a Door County fruit farmer comes down with their cherries and their raspberries and sometimes their peaches, and I buy a whole bunch of them. Now, last weekend, unfortunately, I got there too late and I was not able to get the cherries because I wanted to demonstrate tonight how you make brandied cherries. And it's very simple. My recipe for brandied cherries is you take a 1/4 cup of water, a 1/4 cup of brandy, and a 1/4 cup of sugar. You take the 1/4 cup of water and 1/4 cup of sugar and you pour it in a saucepan, bring it to a boil, add a couple dashes of bitters, a little bit vanilla extract, throw in half of the cherries. I usually like to pit my cherries. Let it boil for 5 minutes, turn it off, throw the rest of the cherries in, put it in a mason jar, top with a little more brandy, and there you go. I had brandied cherries for almost a good 8 months. I finished them off about a month and a half ago. And they taste like summer, and they taste so much better in your cocktails. And they're a lot more reasonably priced than, say, Luxardo cherries, which are really expensive. They're really wonderful for cocktails, but you don't need them. The other thing I've heard is other people will take cherries and just take an equal amount of cherries, sugar, brandy, throw it in a jar. There you go. You can also, I prefer keeping it in my refrigerator, but that's how people would keep fruit fruit in the past is you throw it in alcohol. That's how you make cherry bounce, is you throw a whole bunch of cherries and sugar and booze and you let it sit for a couple months. Now, one other trick I will tell you, I learned from this woman named Joy Perrine. She used to be known as the bad girl of bourbon, and I interviewed her for my Drink Like a Woman cocktail book. And what she suggested is you take 1 cup of whiskey and 1 cup of fresh cranberries, stick it in a mason jar, and wait a month. And so I tried it. You can also do it with brandy, but it was interesting to me because she said it makes a wonderful Christmas cocktail. And I'm like, okay. So after a couple days and a week or two, it looked like cranberries floating in whiskey in a mason jar on my counter. But if you wait longer, up to a month, eventually the color will seep into the whiskey and you have, or brandy, and it becomes a bright red spirit that smells like cranberries. And then you can make cranberry themed cocktails for winter. So I recommend doing that this fall when cranberries are fresh. And then come Thanksgiving or Christmas, you can have cranberry cocktails. You can make a cranberry old fashioned, in fact. But I don't recommend muddling fresh cranberries because they are so sour. They're pretty to garnish cocktails. A very elegant cocktail you can make with Goodland's cranberry liqueur is you put about 1/4 ounce of that in a champagne flute, and then you top it with champagne or sparkling wine and throw in a couple of fresh cranberries on top. It makes a beautiful garnish, but it doesn't taste good. So does anybody have any questions at this point? If you want to just unmute yourself and ask, go right ahead. Any questions? If not, I'd be happy to continue to talk about some of the drinks in our state and their history. Questions, anyone? Okay, I see someone telling me we're enjoying playing along at home. So I'm glad to see. I see a couple people drinking. That's good. I'm
going to make a, I can't find it. I'm going to make a brandy old fashioned Hennessy.
Ooh.
Yummy.
That is delicious. And I do have a story about Paul Hennessy, the, I think, son or grandson of the founder of Hennessy. He came to Milwaukee in the dead of winter in 1947 to present his cognac to our state, which suggests to me right around then we were drinking brandy in good quantities post World War II and post Wisconsin Christian Brothers brandy being distributed. I found that very interesting because he toured the country, and where did he go? He went, of course, to Brandyland or Wisconsin. And it was a cute story I saw in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, or the Journal at the time. But I think that's a great way to step up your old-fashioned, is to use cognac or aged brandy. It's just phenomenal. I always think go with your taste. And if you like a certain brand, go with it. But if you like to step it up, cognac, Armagnac, and good aged brandies. Now, California makes some good aged brandies. One I particularly like is Copper and Kings. They do some interesting aged brandies, and they're kind of California/Kentucky company. And they immediately came to Wisconsin when they decided to make brandy because we know how to drink it. Now, what is funny, in the researching of my book, there's a company called Berthaud. It's a California, New York-based company that makes really good aged California brandy. And I was interviewing one of the founders, and I'm like, well, why aren't you distributed in Wisconsin? And he's like, do they drink brandy? I'm like, you didn't do your research when you formed your company. We drink more brandy than anywhere else. You don't need to teach us how to drink brandy. You just need to bring the good brandy here, and if it's good, we'll drink it. It was one of the funniest interviews I ever had. I'm like, you really should have your brandy distributed here. I don't think it's distributed yet, but it was still very, very funny. And it's like, how do you not know? But again, it was founded by a New York bartender and a California guy, and they decided, well, we want to elevate brandy and reinvent things like the sidecar and brandy in snifters. And it's like, no, in Wisconsin, we know how to drink brandy. We drink lots of it in our old fashions, but also our brandy Alexanders. I think we drink more brandy Alexanders than probably anywhere else in the country. You can go some places elsewhere, and there are a few supper clubs or snooty cocktail bars that will serve it. But what is interesting is that if you go to other places and you order a brandy Alexander or a grasshopper, at least half the time it's going to be made with cream or half and half. It's not going to be made with ice cream. And that was another interesting thing I researched about our state, because we have ice cream drinks. You go to any supper club worth its relish tray, and they're going to make really good ice cream drinks. Now, the bartenders I've talked to, they said, unless you make it in great volumes, like you go to supper clubs, and I've been to like the Hobnob in Kenosha, and they have these giant machines that dish out their brandy Alexanders, their grasshoppers, their other popular ice cream drinks, and they're amazing. But if you're making it from scratch with blenders, they're kind of a pain in the butt to make. And depending on where they are, I interviewed a guy up in Elkhart Lake. His name is Scotty, and he said, yeah, it was a pain in the butt to make because we had to go downstairs to grab our blenders and bring it upstairs and mix it. And it's one of those things, if you make one on ice cream drink at the bar, then suddenly you have a rush of 10 orders. So that is something that I found kind of interesting. But back to the whole ice cream. I interviewed the owner of the Del Bar, and her grandparents started the bar. And she said, when they started the bar, they had both cream-based recipes and ice cream-based recipes, and the ice cream recipes won out. Because, of course, they taste better when they're made with ice cream. And I don't know anyone who would, I mean, there are some people who might prefer the cream-based elegant drinks in the nice little coupe glasses, but I would say the vast majority prefer ice cream drinks because they just taste better. And that's an interesting thing, because brandy Alexanders, grasshoppers, they were not invented here. Grasshoppers were invented in New Orleans, and brandy Alexanders originally, believe it or not, before it became brandy, it was a gin Alexander. And I love gin, but I've never tried a gin Alexander. It just does not sound good to me. But of course, back in those days, sometimes they put egg whites in lemonade too, so I wouldn't do that either. But that was one interesting thing. Now, there are at least 3 drinks that supposedly were created here in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, at Bryant's Cocktail Lounge: the Blue Tail Fly, the Banshee, and the Pink Squirrel. Now, the story goes that the original owner of Bryant's created those recipes for liquor companies and sold them like many bartenders did back then to make extra money, and like bartenders do today. But I could not find evidence that the Pink Squirrel was invented in Wisconsin. I do know that when it debuted, there was an actress who was hired to go around with a dyed pink squirrel to New York nightclubs. And the squirrel ate nuts, and she drank her pink squirrel cocktails. And that was the first mentions I found of a pink squirrel. And of course, it was made with cream, not ice cream. But a year or two after that, I saw it on menus here in Wisconsin. and it was around. So it's possible, and it's a story that's been told and told again, especially at Bryant's, but I can't confirm it. But I like to think it was. And because Bryant's is the oldest cocktail lounge in Wisconsin, I think they have a long history. Now, also, the current owner of Bryant's said he found, when he bought it, he found the old recipes for both cream and ice cream based drinks. So that also goes back to event. One time we would drink it with cream like everywhere else, but we made ice cream. And one reason for the ice cream drinks is we actually had blenders at our bars. And the reason for this is the blenders were manufactured here in Wisconsin in Racine. And that's unusual too. There used to be blenders actually that were created for mixing drinks. So instead of shaking, they could mix it in a blender. They weren't as popular as blenders for home and restaurants, but bars had blenders. So if you go to places outside of Wisconsin, you go to bars, they don't have blenders usually. But here in Wisconsin, many, many bars and of course supper clubs have blenders, and they lend themselves to ice cream drink. Plus, of course, we're the dairy state. And the owner of Bryant said, well, I like to think here in Wisconsin, we can take something that's not good for you and make it more unhealthy. It'll taste better, but it'll be more unhealthy for you. And I think that's kind of funny, but true. Speaking of ice cream, one of the things I have learned in my research, that if you have vanilla ice cream and you want to dress it up, it actually tastes pretty good if you put a couple dashes of Angostura bitters on it. It's an interesting, fun flavor. I also think pouring straight brandy on ice cream also tastes good. Another drink that is very Wisconsin, and you will get called out elsewhere, is the Bloody Mary. Now, the Bloody Mary, of course, was not invented here. It was likely invented, the stories say it was invented in New York or it was invented in Paris. But the Bloody Mary was invented in the 1940s around, and then it spread throughout the country. And of course, we drank it in Wisconsin. But the difference is, here in Wisconsin, when you order a Bloody Mary, it's always served with a beer chaser, and that's included. And then you get a meal on top of your Bloody Mary. Now, the whole meal thing, we always added extra things to a Bloody Mary, but the whole meal thing came from Sobelman's in Milwaukee. And basically one day he stuck an entire burger on top of it, put it on Facebook, and it got more likes and it got crazier. So he started doing things like putting an entire fried chicken on top, and other bars, of course, imitated right away. And I think any good bar that's worth its Bloody Mary will have lots of good things on top, but they also really have a good mix. And some places that do it, they have things to keep it mixing and special things to keep it chilled. But the main thing is have a really good mix for your Bloody Mary, and then really fun ingredients. My favorite story about the Bloody Mary was in the 1970s when all the children in Madison went back to school. There's a certain neighborhood in Madison, and all the moms would break out pictures of Bloody Mary the day their kids went back to school. And having an 11-year-old myself, I understand why they did that. But that's one of my favorite stories. And the other interesting thing about Wisconsin is, although we drink more brandy than anywhere else, we only have a couple of makers here in Wisconsin that make brandy. Now, we have Great Lakes and their Applewoods. We also have Central Standard that makes a brandy. And they also make a brandy for Kohler, which is a chocolate brandy or a mint chocolate brandy. And then there are a couple of winemakers as well who make Wisconsin brandy here. And it's really good. And that's something that I think is interesting, because now if you want to, you can make an old fashioned with all Wisconsin ingredients, except for the oranges, I would say, because unless they're grown, you have a greenhouse to grow your oranges, you're going to have to import those. But we've been importing citrus for quite a while, and that works. Does anyone have any questions or comments or your favorite stories about the old fashioned? And how do you drink your old fashions? Do you drink them with club soda? Do you drink them with sweet soda or sour soda? That's the other interesting sort of angle. When you go to a bar and you order an old fashioned, they will ask you, do you want brandy or do you want bourbon? And then they'll ask you, do you want it sweet or sour? The other interesting thing is people will also specifically ask for different garnishes. And back to Scotty at Elkhart Lake, he basically said the weirdest request he got was a vodka old fashioned garnished with olives. And the guy who ordered it said, well, I've been ordering this for 40 years. And Scotty says, well, I've been making it for 40 years, and this is the first time I've had this request. And Scotty is at Lola's at the resort up in Elkhart, and he's a really good bartender. He's one of the bartenders I interviewed. I interviewed bartenders from across the state. And one of the interesting things I found is we have a lot of bartenders who are very inventive, and they're also now kind of creating their own spins, and they hope to eventually create classic cocktails that get repeated, not just here in Wisconsin, but everywhere. And there are some interesting ones. And there's one called the King's Way, which is made with cognac. And it's cognac and honey syrup and a couple other ingredients. And it's quite delightful. And the bartender who created it, Adam Sarkis, said, in order to create a classic cocktail, you need to create a cocktail that is made of ingredients that are pretty common at bars. And that made sense to me, because if a bar doesn't have a specific Amaro or liqueur, they're not going to make it. But if it's made with things that are common, then they'll make it. And that's one thing right now I'm currently researching my next book, which is the Whiskey Sour book. And one thing I've found is there are some classic cocktails that are basically twists on the whiskey sour. And one of them is called the penicillin. And it's basically a whiskey sour, but it's made with a honey ginger syrup. And then there's also a Ward 8, and that's made with the addition of orange juice. And then there's one called a Gold Rush, and the only change is it's made with a plain honey syrup. So again, common ingredients, similar to the original cocktail, but slightly different, but not different enough to be weird, because that's the other thing. Although bartenders like to drink things that are really unusual, like Fernet Branca straight or Malort or whatever, most consumers, we drink what we like, and we then branch out to things that are similar or sound interesting or tasty. And that's kind of what creates a classic cocktail, something that is easily quaffable, and something that's easily drinkable, and something that you'll want to drink again. Because I've had plenty of great cocktails, but I may never have them again, and I may never really want them again. But the ones that I want over and over again, they're things that also your palate can recognize. And the other thing is there are, I think there's a lot of great bartenders, but sometimes when you talk to bartenders, like for example, you talk about simple syrup, and they make it sound like it's this really complicated thing. But I was talking to a friend earlier tonight, and I love my friend dearly, but she's like, I don't even know what a simple syrup is. I said, Kelty, it's equal parts sugar and water. Okay, so it's like Kool-Aid, but without the color. You got it. Simple sugar, water, nothing more than that. And I know that depending on different bars, they'll put, well, we put 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. don't even worry about that. If you do equal parts sugar and water and it's not sweet enough for you, there's a really simple solution. You just add a little more simple syrup. That's all. And I like to keep things simple. Don't make it more complicated. The other thing I would say is when you go out to bars or restaurants, and if something isn't to your liking, it's okay to tell them, I want it a little bit sweeter. I have a really good friend who grew up in Green Bay, and that's another thing. The further north you go in Wisconsin, the sweeter the cocktails typically get. And this dear friend of mine, we went to a bar in Milwaukee, the Tin Widow, and I don't remember what she ordered, but she's like, this doesn't taste right. I said, well, just go ask them to add a little more simple syrup. Guess what? The bartender had no problem adding another 1/4 ounce of simple syrup, and she loved it. So don't be afraid of doing that. And if they're really good bartenders, be sure to tip them because they work hard, and most of them are wonderful human beings. Although I will say, I remember I had a female editor of a Milwaukee magazine I wrote regularly for, and she went to this hoity-toity new hotel bar, and this male bartender, the typical stereotype with the mustache and the armbands and the tattoos, and he was trying to convince her she wanted something else, and she's like, I just wanted a brandy old-fashioned sweet. That's what I wanted. Don't make me feel bad for wanting it the way I wanted it. And I said, well, that happens, but most bartenders are not going to be like that. Most of them are like, you don't like it, I'll make it so that you like it. And that's the other thing also, to know your own palate. If you like it sweeter or if you like it less sweet, if you like it with a little more sour or a little more bitter, just knowing. And don't be afraid to experiment. It's just booze. And if it's really bad, you can pour it out, or you can give it to your neighbors and maybe they'll like it. When I test cocktails, if I don't like it, I give it to someone who will like it, or I just pour it out. It's okay to experiment and to try different things. And speaking of different versions of the old fashioned, some of my favorite ones are when they replace the cherries with seasonal blueberries or raspberries, or again, use a very high quality cognac instead of straight up brandy. Those are simple things you can do to dress it up and make it taste great. And don't be afraid of asking for what you want and trying things. It should be fun.